The quiet hum of a jet engine usually means possibility, new journeys, new beginnings. But on Flight 227, that hum was interrupted by a single whisper meant to wound. A wealthy passenger leaned across the aisle, looked at a black woman in first class, and said the words that would ignite everything. This isn't Coach. What she did not know, what she could not have imagined, was that the woman she tried to dismiss was not just another passenger. She was Dr. Naomi Sinclair, a senior inspector for the Federal Aviation Administration. A woman whose ears could hear danger in the smallest crack of composite metal. A woman who carried the quiet authority to ground an entire international flight with a single phone call. But here is the question. What happens when prejudice collides with power, when arrogance pushes against integrity, and when one calm, steady voice refuses to be silenced? Could a whisper unravel an empire? Could a single act of dignity expose corruption that stretched far beyond the walls of a single aircraft? Stay with us. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. The story begins now. The low hum of the engines outside Boston Logan's glass windows felt almost like music. For most travelers, that sound was background noise. For Dr. Naomi Sinclair, it was a promise of destinations and reunions, of new discoveries, and of the fragile miracle that kept hundreds of thousands of people suspended in the sky every day. Naomi sat quietly in the International First Class Lounge, a tall glass of sparkling water on the table beside her. The leather armchairs were deep and expensive, the lighting carefully engineered to feel soft yet important. The air smelled faintly of espresso beans and polished wood. It was, in many ways, an oasis of calm. But Naomi's mind, as always, was not still. She was supposed to be off duty. A week in London would begin with her keynote speech at the International Aviation Safety Symposium, where she would speak about microscopic stress fractures in composite fuselage panels. To most people, that topic sounded like a cure for insomnia. To her, it was poetry. The way invisible cracks could grow beneath the surface until a structure failed, this was her lifelong obsession, and her gift. Her black slacks were tailored but comfortable. She wore a sleeveless silk blouse in deep navy, and practical leather loafers that had carried her through hundreds of airport terminals. Her locks were neatly pinned back from her face. She wasn't trying to make a statement with her look, and yet her presence did. Quiet confidence radiated from her without her forcing it. She scrolled through the final slides of her presentation on a slim tablet. Bullet points about torsional stress, data from ultrasonic testing, diagrams of honeycomb composites. She paused, tilted her head slightly, and smiled. There was an elegance in the science of safety that few appreciated, but she had learned to find beauty in it. Naomi had lived a life of discipline and vigilance. She saw the world not only as it was, but as a network of unseen forces. On a sidewalk, she would notice the hairline crack in a slab of concrete and think about load distribution. On a bridge, her eyes would instinctively search for signs of rust. Inside a plane, she couldn't help but listen for unusual vibrations, the subtle whispers of stress at work. That perspective made her brilliant at her job. It also made her weary. Sometimes she wished she could just relax and let the world be. Her gaze drifted toward the bar at the far end of the lounge. A couple had entered loud, unmistakable, the type of people who didn't walk into a room but announced themselves to it. The woman was wrapped in a beige cashmere shawl, hair lacquered into an immovable wave. Her face was tight with surgical precision, and her voice carried an entitled sharpness that pierced the calm atmosphere. "Honestly, Charles," she said with a dramatic sigh, "you would think for what we pay, they could at least stock a decent champagne. This is practically Prosecco." Her husband, a man in his late 50s with a suit tailored to hide the soft curve of his stomach, nodded in quiet submission. His phone was already at his ear, his tone urgent as though the world depended on whatever merger he was discussing. Naomi let her eyes drop back to her tablet. She had encountered this type countless times before, people who move through the world as though it were constructed purely for their convenience, with everyone else cast as extras in their private production. They irritated her less now than they used to. Age and experience had taught her to conserve her energy, but she still felt the sting, that familiar burn of being appraised, dismissed, and diminished by strangers who didn't know her story. She took a slow breath, exhaled, and let the feeling pass. Outside. The afternoon sun caught the wing of a waiting Boeing 787, the same model as her upcoming flight. Naomi studied the movement of the ground crew, the hydraulic loaders, the careful dance of equipment and people. Most passengers would see chaos. She saw choreography, a ballet of logistics and safety checks that made modern flight possible. Her phone buzzed once with a reminder: boarding TAA Flight 212 to London, Gate E12. Naomi closed her tablet, slipped it into her leather briefcase, and stood. She straightened her blouse, rolled her shoulders, and allowed herself a moment to look out at the plane once more. A metal bird, 300 tons of aluminum and composite, about to carry hundreds of souls across the Atlantic. When the announcement came, Transatlantic Air, Flight 212 to London, now boarding first-class passengers, the lounge stirred with quiet activity. Naomi walked calmly toward the gate. Ahead of her, she noticed the same couple from the bar. Charles was still speaking into his phone, waving one hand with an air of self-importance. The woman, Elaine, she had heard him call her, directed a porter with the authority of a monarch instructing her court. Their luggage was excessive, even by first-class standards, gleaming hard-shell cases in metallic tones, leather handbags that looked like museum pieces. Naomi smiled inwardly. It wasn't her place to judge, but she couldn't help but think of all the hidden hands that would have to lift, secure, and stow those bags so Elaine could recline in luxury. Naomi approached the gate last, as she preferred. The agent scanned her boarding pass. "Welcome aboard, Dr. Sinclair, seat 2A. Enjoy your flight." The warmth in the agent's voice softened the edges of Naomi's weariness. She walked down the jet bridge, the familiar sensation of narrowing space wrapping around her, the metallic echo of rolling wheels, the faint vibration of engines spooling, the smell of fuel and pressurized air. For Naomi, this was home. Halfway down the corridor, her path came to an abrupt halt. Elaine Whitford stood in the middle of the jet bridge, fussing with the telescopic handle of a massive silver carry-on. "Charles, this handle is sticking," she snapped, tugging with visible frustration. "I told you we should have bought the titanium model." Charles didn't look up from his phone, just jiggle it. "Elaine." Naomi waited, patient, her hand resting lightly on her briefcase strap. She could have forced her way past, but she chose instead to speak gently. "Excuse me, may I get by?" Elaine turned, her eyes sweeping Naomi from head to toe. The look was quick, but it carried centuries. A look that wasn't just seeing, but measuring, calculating, judging. Naomi felt the sting even before Elaine smiled a small, dismissive curl of the lips, a gesture that said, "Without words, you don't belong here." Naomi felt anger flare hot in her chest, then cool just as quickly. Getting angry was a luxury she could not afford. She had learned that long ago. She spoke again, firmer this time. "Excuse me, I need to get by." Charles finally ended his call and pulled the bag's handle with a sharp yank. It slid into place. The couple moved forward. Naomi followed, her sense of calm restored, though tinged with the familiar weariness of yet another small battle. She stepped onto the aircraft, turned left into first class, and found her seat. The day had only just begun, and already she could feel the invisible fractures of tension forming. She had no idea how far those cracks were about to spread. The jet bridge always carried a certain hum, a hollow echo of footsteps and suitcase wheels. For most passengers, it was just a hallway to endure. For Naomi Sinclair, it was the threshold between the safety of the ground and the fragile miracle of flight. She stepped carefully, not out of hesitation, but out of a lifelong habit of awareness. Ahead of her, Elaine Whitford continued her minor battle with the gleaming silver suitcase. The handle rattled and clicked, refusing to cooperate. Elaine yanked it with sharp, irritated motions, each tug punctuated with a huff. Charles stood just behind her, phone pressed once again to his ear, murmuring into it in low, urgent tones about shareholders and quarterly reports. His free hand moved lazily, as if dismissing invisible assistants in front of him. Naomi waited with the patience of someone who had stood in countless security lines and boarding queues. She shifted the weight of her briefcase from one hand to the other, her eyes lingering on the faint stress lines etched into the jet bridge walls. Paint chipped here and there, tiny imperfections that her mind cataloged automatically. She wondered if anyone besides her ever noticed such things. Elaine finally managed to jerk the suitcase handle free, muttering something sharp under her breath. She glanced back again, her eyes catching Naomi's. For a moment, their gazes locked. It was only an instant, but Naomi felt the sting. Elaine's expression wasn't open curiosity, nor was it simple indifference. It was that particular kind of look Naomi had encountered too many times before, the cool calculation of someone deciding what kind of person you must be, and whether you deserved the space you occupied. Naomi had learned to armor herself against such moments. She inhaled slowly, exhaled, and reminded herself that she had more important things to carry than resentment. She was on her way to represent her agency, her profession, her expertise. She had spent years proving herself in spaces where she was underestimated. Today would be no different. Inside the cabin, first class gleamed with muted gold accents and brushed steel. The pod-like seats stretched out in comfortable angles, each one a self-contained cocoon of luxury. Naomi found 2A, a window seat she had selected deliberately. She liked windows, not because she needed to look outside, but because they gave her a sense of grounding, a way to orient herself in the world even when suspended 35,000 feet above it. Elaine and Charles settled into 1A and 1B, directly in front of her. Their belongings seemed to multiply with each passing minute: handbags, coats, travel pillows, and the ever-present silver case that Elaine hovered over like it contained the crown jewels. Naomi placed her briefcase gently beneath the seat, slipped off her loafers, and pulled on the complimentary airline socks. She adjusted her neck pillow, arranged her tablet in the seat pocket, and leaned back, letting her body relax into the smooth leather. A flight attendant with carefully pinned hair and a weary smile approached. "Welcome aboard. Can I get you something to drink before takeoff? We have champagne, orange juice, or water." "Water with lemon, please," Naomi said warmly. The attendant nodded and turned away. As she did, Naomi heard it, a whisper, sharp enough to slash through the air yet quiet enough to pretend it wasn't meant for anyone else. "This isn't Coach, dear." Naomi's head lifted slowly. Elaine had leaned slightly toward Charles, her voice pitched just high enough for the words to carry across the aisle. Her eyes flicked toward Naomi and then away again, dismissing her with surgical precision. Charles shifted uncomfortably. "Elaine, please," he muttered, keeping his voice low, but not low enough to erase the awkwardness. Naomi felt the air in the cabin shift. The other passengers, all comfortably nestled in their leather pods, seemed suddenly fascinated by their safety cards or the glossy magazines tucked into their seat pockets. No one looked directly at her, but Naomi could feel their awareness, the collective silence that followed when cruelty entered the room. She kept her eyes steady on Elaine for a long moment. She did not glare. She did not frown. She simply looked, her gaze calm and precise, a glacier of composure that gave nothing away. The silence stretched between them until it became a kind of power, pressing back against the whisper that had been meant to diminish her. Finally, Naomi spoke, her voice low and even. "I'm in 2A, she said. "I suggest you find your seat." The words carried no anger, only finality. Elaine blinked, surprised that her jab had met resistance. She huffed softly, then turned back to Charles, muttering about overhead space and her dinner reservations in London. Naomi leaned back again, her chest tightening not with rage but with a familiar weariness. It was never just about one comment. It was about the accumulation, the steady layer-in of moments like this that formed an unspoken weight. But she had survived far heavier burdens. The attendant returned with her water. Naomi smiled and accepted it, her tone gentle as she thanked her. She sipped slowly, letting the cool lemon sting remind her of the discipline she lived by. A second flight attendant moved through the cabin, offering hot towels. Naomi accepted one, pressing the warm cloth lightly to her face. The simple ritual brought her back to center. Still, she couldn't shake the awareness of Elaine's presence just a seat ahead. The woman's movements were sharp, impatient. Every gesture seemed designed to draw attention, from the way she rearranged her shawl to the dramatic sigh she released when Charles failed to respond quickly enough. Naomi caught herself wondering, why did people like Elaine feel threatened by her calm? Why did her quiet presence in a space seem to provoke irritation in others? She had never raised her voice, never intruded on anyone else's comfort. Yet again and again, she found herself cast as the disruption simply by existing where others didn't expect her to be. Her phone buzzed once more with a calendar reminder. She slid it into airplane mode and tucked it away. The presentation could wait. What mattered now was the journey. The boarding announcements continued, the cabin filling slowly with other first-class passengers. Some nodded politely to Naomi as they passed, offering the neutral kindness of strangers. Others avoided her eyes altogether, slipping quickly into their pods. Naomi breathed in deeply, exhaled, and let the hum of the engines beneath her feet become her anchor. She told herself, as she often did, that dignity was not the absence of insult, but the refusal to let insult define you. Yet she could not know, not yet, that Elaine's whisper had been the first crack in what would soon become a catastrophic fault line. She could not know that the silver suitcase above her head carried more than just luxury. It carried the weight of arrogance pressed against the brittle shell of safety. Naomi leaned her head back against the seat, eyes half closed. She reminded herself that she was off duty, that she deserved this week in London. The lectures, the museums, the quiet walks along the Thames she had promised herself. She whispered inwardly, almost like a prayer, let this be just another flight. But the universe, as she would soon discover, had other plans. The doors of the aircraft closed with a solid thud, sealing in not only the passengers and their baggage, but also the tension that had begun to grow. The air was thick, charged, as though every small act, every whisper, every glance had been stored up, waiting for release. Naomi Sinclair sipped her water once more, her mind sharpening even as her body appeared relaxed. She had spent her life preparing for failures no one else could see. And today, sitting quietly in seat 2A, she felt the faintest tremor of one approaching. The cabin lights dimmed to a soft golden hue as the last of the boarding passengers settled into their seats. Flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisles, stowing coats, checking seat numbers, and offering the kind of professional smiles that concealed exhaustion. Naomi Sinclair adjusted her seat belt, slipping it across her lap with quiet precision. Her tablet rested in the pocket beside her, her glass of water half empty on the armrest. From just ahead, Elaine Whitford leaned across the aisle toward her husband. She lowered her voice, but not quite enough. It was one of those practiced whispers meant to humiliate without ever admitting intention. "I don't know what's happening with this airline," Elaine murmured, her lips curling into a sharp line. "They're letting just anyone up here now. It's supposed to be exclusive." Naomi heard every word. Charles shifted in his seat, his cheeks flushing. He gave a quick glance over his shoulder toward Naomi, then back at his wife. "Elaine, enough," he muttered. His tone carried the weight of someone long accustomed to managing his partner's sharp edges, a weary attempt at damage control. But Elaine was not finished. Her hand fluttered in the air as if brushing away an invisible annoyance. "I paid for first class. Charles, I expect first class." Naomi closed her eyes briefly, inhaling through her nose. The air smelled faintly of citrus and fabric cleaner. She told herself to let it go. She had heard worse. She had endured worse. Words, no matter how sharp, could not cut through the armor she had spent a lifetime building. Still, the sting remained, not because of its originality, but because of its predictability. When she opened her eyes again, she focused on the window beside her. Outside, the last pieces of luggage were being loaded into the belly of the aircraft. She watched the ground crew maneuver the containers, her trained eye noting the efficiency of their movements. Each latch, each hydraulic lift, each signal from a fluorescent-vested worker was part of a system that demanded precision. It calmed her, reminded her that beyond the pettiness of whispers, the true weight of flight rested on diligence and care. The flight attendant, Bridget Owens, returned with Naomi's water. She placed it gently on the armrest, her smile polite but strained. Naomi noticed the tightness around her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the tray. "Thank you," Naomi said softly. Bridget gave a quick nod, then moved forward to assist Elaine and Charles. Naomi watched as Elaine ordered champagne, her voice laced with condescension. She dismissed Bridget with a wave, then leaned back in her seat as if the cabin were her private domain. The quiet hum of the auxiliary power unit filled the silence. Naomi leaned her head against the seat back, letting her thoughts drift. She thought of London, of the museum she planned to visit, of the lecture hall filled with colleagues eager to hear her presentation. She thought of how far she had come from her childhood neighborhood, where airplanes had been something distant, something to marvel at from the cracked pavement below. Her mind slipped into memory, as it often did in these moments of stillness. She remembered sitting with her father in their small backyard, pointing at contrails streaking across the sky. "You see that?" "Naomi," he had said, "that's possibility. That's proof that nothing heavy is too heavy if you understand the science behind it." Those words had carried her through years of study, through lonely nights poring over textbooks, through the skepticism of peers who underestimated her, through every examination she had passed to earn the badge that now rested in her wallet, the badge that gave her authority few understood, authority that could ground a plane or halt an airline's operation with a single call. She had no intention of using that power today. Today was supposed to be about rest, about reclaiming balance after months of grueling inspections. But power, like gravity, had a way of asserting itself when ignored. Elaine's voice cut through again, softer this time, but still deliberate. "Look at her, Charles, sitting there like she belongs. It's laughable." Charles sighed, pressing his fingers to the bridge of his nose. He muttered something Naomi couldn't hear. Elaine responded with another sharp exhale, then shifted in her seat, pulling the silver suitcase closer toward her feet. She fussed with the zippers, rearranging items as though proving her dominion over space itself. Naomi's pulse quickened, not from fear, not from anger, but from the unmistakable tension that came when disrespect lingered in the air. She had faced this countless times, subtle comments at conferences, questioning stares at security checkpoints, dismissive tones from colleagues who thought her knowledge less valid because of her skin, her hair, her gender. Each time, she had learned to measure her response, to choose between silence and confrontation, between dignity and eruption. She chose silence now, but it was not submission, it was strategy. She would not give Elaine the performance she wanted. She would not transform into the caricature Elaine expected. She would remain calm, remain still, remain herself. The boarding door closed with a metallic thud. The captain's voice came over the intercom, warm but professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Transatlantic Air Flight 212 service to London Heathrow. Our flying time today will be 6 hours and 40 minutes. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened as we prepare for departure." The hum of the engines deepened, vibrating gently through the cabin floor. Naomi let the sound anchor her. She reached down to adjust her seat belt once more, the motion deliberate, grounding. Bridget passed through again, checking latches, confirming seat belts. When she reached the Whitfords, her posture stiffened. Naomi watched carefully. Elaine gestured toward the silver case, insisting that it remain in the overhead bin despite its size. Bridget hesitated, her professional mask cracking for just an instant. Naomi saw it in her eyes, the conflict between duty and fear, between regulation and the threat of reprisal from wealthy passengers. Naomi knew that conflict well. She had lived it, studied it, enforced it. Safety was not a suggestion, it was law. And yet, again and again, she had seen it compromised by ego, by arrogance, by the insatiable hunger for privilege. She turned her gaze back to the window, willing herself to let it go, to stay silent. But somewhere, deep inside, a small tremor began to stir, the first hint of a quake she could not yet see. The plane began its slow push back from the gate, the ground crew guiding it into position. The lights in the cabin flickered softly, the faint roar of the engines swelling like an overture. Naomi closed her eyes, whispering to herself the mantra that had guided her through every crisis, every confrontation. Stay calm, stay precise, stay unbreakable. She did not yet realize how quickly those words would be tested. The cabin was warm with the low hum of anticipation. Passengers busied themselves with arranging pillows, adjusting seats, and flipping through glossy magazines no one really intended to read. Naomi Sinclair sat steady in 2A, the calm center of her own world, but her eyes, sharp and trained, kept drifting toward the gleaming silver carry-on case that Elaine Whitford had stubbornly wedged into the space above row 1. At first glance, it was just a suitcase, expensive, oversized, the kind of luggage chosen more for appearance than practicality. But Naomi knew better than to take anything at face value, especially inside an aircraft. In her world, danger often arrived disguised as ordinary. The first sign came when Bridget Owens, the flight attendant, paused at the Whitford's row. Her voice was polite, but Naomi caught the steel edge of procedure beneath it. Mr. and Mrs. Whitford. I'm afraid that roller case is too large for the overhead bin. The compartment will not close properly, for safety reasons. I will need to gate check it. Elaine's face hardened as though she had just been insulted in her own home. Absolutely not, she snapped. This bag stays with me. It has my medication, and besides, it is a standard size. Do not tell me what I can or cannot bring into first class. Naomi's jaw tightened. She could hear the impatience vibrating in Elaine's voice. It was the same tone she had used in her whisper, the same entitlement sharpened into a blade. Bridget stood her ground. She gestured toward the plaque inside the bin that displayed the maximum size requirements. Ma'am, it exceeds our aircraft dimensions. If it cannot be secured, it becomes a safety issue during turbulence. Charles Whitford shifted in his seat, sensing the escalation. He slipped a black metallic card from his wallet, holding it up like a shield. Perhaps you don't realize who we are. We are Transatlantic Apex members. This bag will stay exactly where my wife wants it. I suggest you make it fit, or we will be having a very serious conversation with your supervisor. The words landed like a slap. Naomi watched Bridget's composure falter. Her lips parted as if to protest, then closed again. Fear flickered in her eyes. Naomi knew what she was thinking. A complaint from an Apex member could derail her career, jeopardize her livelihood. She was being forced to choose between protocol and survival. Naomi's chest tightened. This was not just about arrogance anymore. This was about systemic rot, the very disease she had spent her career diagnosing. The pressure to appease privilege had twisted itself into the bones of the airline, forcing good employees to ignore the very rules designed to keep passengers safe. Bridget tried again, her voice faint. Let me see if I can rearrange some things. She opened the bin, which was already full with coats and smaller bags. She shifted items carefully, but the silver case was simply too wide, too rigid. Just push it, Elaine ordered, her patience gone. It will fit. Naomi sat upright, her instincts screaming. The tension in the air was more than social now. It was physical, pressing against the cabin walls. Bridget, pale and trembling, tried to push the suitcase deeper into the compartment. It would not budge. Oh, for heaven's sake, give it here. Elaine huffed. She seized the bag herself, muscles straining as she shoved it at an unnatural angle. Charles rose halfway from his seat and added his weight to the effort. Together, they forced the door upward until the latch clicked shut under unnatural pressure. It was in that moment that Naomi heard it, a sharp, distinct crack. To the untrained ear, it would have been nothing more than a faint snap, drowned out by the shuffle of boarding passengers and the muted roar of engines. But Naomi's ear was trained. To her, it was as loud as an explosion. She knew the sound of composite material under torsional stress, the high-pitched fracture of phenolic resin splitting away from its honeycomb core. Her blood ran cold. That overhead bin was not just a plastic container. It was a structural component, designed to withstand the forces of turbulence, to bear the weight of luggage in conditions where gravity shifted violently. If its integrity was compromised, the entire assembly could collapse. Hundreds of pounds of baggage could rain down onto passengers. In extreme conditions, the entire bin could detach from the fuselage ceiling. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, steadying her breath. This was no longer a matter of insult or dignity. This was life and death. She unbuckled her seatbelt and rose. Bridget had stepped back, her face flushed, her hands trembling. Naomi approached her calmly, her voice low but clear. "Excuse me. I heard a crack when that door was forced shut. You need to open the bin and inspect the latch and housing immediately." Bridget's eyes widened. "Ma'am, it is closed now. It is fine. It was forced shut under extreme pressure," Naomi repeated. Her tone carried the calm weight of authority. "The structural integrity may be compromised. You cannot determine that without inspection. Please open it." Elaine turned sharply, her expression one of triumph, now curdling into fury. "Oh, will you just stop? You are not the pilot. You are not in charge. Sit down and mind your own business." Naomi ignored her. She kept her eyes on Bridget. "Your airline's operations manual and federal regulations require you to ensure all compartments are properly secured. That means safe, not just closed. You cannot confirm that without opening the bin. I'm asking you, as a professional, to do your duty. Open it." Her voice was steady, but beneath it, Naomi felt her pulse quicken. She knew the stakes. She also knew the resistance she was about to face. From the cockpit, the first officer emerged. Ryan Keller, young, confident, his dark hair slicked back as if for a magazine shoot. He approached with the swagger of someone who believed authority came from the stripes on his shoulders. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked. His tone clipped. Bridget faltered. "This passenger is insisting we reopen the bin. Mrs. Whitford's case was a tight fit, but it is secure." Ryan's eyes flicked toward Naomi. They scanned her in a glance too quick and too dismissive. A black woman in locks making technical demands. His mind had already filed her under nuisance. "Ma'am," he said with a patronizing smile, "the door is closed, the light is green, and we are on schedule. Please take your seat so we can depart." Naomi felt the chill of recognition. She had been here before, in boardrooms and on tarmacs, dismissed by men too young or too arrogant to realize the limits of their understanding. She let her voice harden, the softness falling away to reveal steel. "First Officer Keller, I am not a passenger. I am Dr. Naomi Sinclair, Senior Inspector with the FAA, badge number 741 Bravo. I'm telling you, I heard a sound consistent with a composite stress fracture. Under federal regulation, you're obligated to investigate a credible report of a safety hazard from a qualified professional. That is me. So, I will say this once more. Open the bin. The cabin froze. Elaine's smirk faltered. Charles sat back down. Pale. Bridget's breath caught, and for the first time, Ryan Keller's confident mask cracked. The first officer's silence lasted only a breath, but in that breath, Naomi Sinclair felt the tension coil through the cabin. Ryan Keller's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as if weighing whether to challenge her further. He finally straightened his posture, shoulders squared in the crisp lines of his uniform. "Dr. Sinclair," he said, his voice carefully measured. "I respect your concern, but I am the officer responsible for this flight. The bin is closed. We have a schedule to keep. Please return to your seat." It was the same dismissal wrapped in a softer tone. Naomi could feel the eyes of every passenger in the first-class cabin pressing on her, waiting to see what she would do. She refused to shrink. "First Officer Keller," she replied, her words calm and deliberate, respectfully. "This is not a matter of schedule or perception. It is a matter of compliance with federal regulation. If you ignore a report from a certified FAA inspector, you're not only risking lives, you're violating the law." Her words landed like pebbles dropped into still water, spreading ripples of unease. Elaine Whitford, however, could not let silence linger. She rose halfway from her seat, her voice dripping venom. "This is ridiculous. She is trying to cause trouble. We are paying customers, and she is ruining our flight. Charles, do something." Charles sank deeper into his seat, his hand gripping the armrest. "Elaine, enough," he whispered. Though his voice trembled, Naomi kept her eyes on Ryan. "Open the bin." The cockpit door opened again. This time, Captain Marcus Hale stepped out. His presence carried the gravity of experience. His silver hair, weathered face, and steady gait marked him as a man who had spent 4 decades navigating storms in both the sky and in life. Yet his eyes betrayed exhaustion. A man stretched thin by too many hours in too many cockpits. "What's happening here?" Hale asked, his voice firm but tinged with weariness. Ryan spoke quickly, seizing the moment. "Captain, this passenger claims she heard a crack in the overhead bin. I told her it is secure, but she's refusing to sit down. The Whitfords confirm everything is fine." Naomi turned her gaze to the captain, unflinching. "Captain Hale, my name is Dr. Naomi Sinclair. I'm a senior FAA inspector. I identified myself and informed your officer that I heard a sound consistent with composite fracture when that bin was forced closed. I'm advising that it be inspected before departure." The weight of her words hung in the air. Hale's eyes flicked from Naomi to Elaine, then to the bin itself. He hesitated. Naomi could almost see the calculation happening behind his eyes: delay the flight and anger a high-status passenger, or trust the instinct of someone he had never met. Elaine seized the silence. "Captain, this is absurd. We have places to be. My husband has important meetings. That bag is fine. This woman is trying to cause a scene." Her words struck like poison. Hale's lips pressed into a thin line. He wanted this resolved quickly, quietly. He looked at Naomi once more, his voice carrying the authority of command. "Doctor, I appreciate your concern, but my crew has assessed the situation, and the compartment is secure. We're not delaying this flight over a noise you think you heard. That is my decision. Please sit down. That is an order." The air seemed to thicken, heavy with the weight of dismissal. Naomi's heart pounded, but her face remained composed. She had given them every opportunity. She had stated her credentials, cited the regulations, explained the risk. She had moved from polite to firm to authoritative. And still, she had been silenced. She stared at the captain for a long moment. The silence was no longer passive. It was sharp, deliberate. Finally, she inclined her head. Her voice, when it came, was almost serene. "As you wish, Captain." She turned and walked back to her seat. Elaine's triumphant smirk returned, curling across her lips like victory. Ryan exhaled, a quiet sigh of relief, as though the problem had been neatly folded away. Hale followed him back into the cockpit, his shoulders weighted with fatigue. Naomi sat down, buckled her belt, and placed her hands calmly on her lap. Inside, however, her thoughts raced. She had been dismissed before, but never when the stakes were this immediate, this clear. The sound of that fracture replayed in her memory, sharp and undeniable. She considered her options. She could remain silent, endure the flight, and hope turbulence did not push the bin beyond its limits. She could allow arrogance and fear to dictate the fate of 300 souls. Or she could act, even if it meant becoming the disruption they accused her of being. She thought of her father's words. Nothing heavy is too heavy if you understand the science behind it. She thought of the years she had spent proving herself, of the regulations etched into her mind like scripture, of the badge in her wallet that gave her the power to protect when others would not. Naomi's fingers slid into her briefcase, retrieving her phone. She scrolled to a number not found in any public directory, a number reserved for emergencies that bypassed switchboards and secretaries. She placed the phone face down on her armrest, her expression serene, as if she were just another passenger settling in. The cabin door sealed shut. The engines roared to life, vibrating through the floor, the sound swelling like an approaching storm. Elaine leaned back, sipping her champagne with smug satisfaction. Charles closed his eyes, weary. Bridget moved through the aisles, her smile brittle. Naomi glanced once more at the silver case above her head. The crack she had heard was not a figment of imagination. It was a warning, and warnings, when ignored, became tragedies. Her pulse slowed, steadying into the rhythm of resolve. She had been patient. She had been professional. Now she would be something more. She would be the consequence. The engines surged louder, the aircraft beginning to roll. Naomi lifted her phone, unlocked it, and pressed the call button. "FAA Northeast Regional Operations Center," came the crisp voice on the other end. Naomi's own voice was calm, almost chilling in its clarity. "This is Inspector Naomi Sinclair. Badge 741 Bravo. I'm on Transatlantic Air Flight 212 registration, November 773, Tango Alpha. I'm grounding this aircraft effective immediately. There is a credible, uninspected structural threat in the cabin. Notify JFK Tower to rescind takeoff clearance. I want a full ground crew and inspection team at the gate. Acknowledge." There was a pause, brief but absolute. Then the voice returned. Steady. Acknowledged. "Inspector. Ground and order in effect. Stand by." Naomi ended the call, placed the phone gently on the armrest, and folded her hands. Her gaze remained fixed on the window as the engines, which had been building toward departure, suddenly spooled down into silence. The aircraft shuddered, then halted. Confusion rippled through the cabin. Elaine's smug smile dissolved. "What is going on?" she demanded, her voice shrill. Naomi remained still, her eyes calm, her heartbeat steady. For the first time since boarding, she felt no weight of weariness, no sting of dismissal. She felt only the quiet certainty of action. She had done what the captain would not. She had listened to the warning. She had chosen the truth over the schedule, safety over arrogance, and now the entire flight, 300 lives, and the fragile reputation of an airline sat in the balance of her single, deliberate choice. The confrontation was not over. It had only just begun. The sound of engines fading caught the passengers off guard. A moment ago, the aircraft had been alive with the deep, steady hum that promised takeoff. Now, silence spread through the cabin, heavy and unnatural. The forward motion stopped. The seatbelt signs still glowed, but the plane no longer moved. Confusion broke out in small murmurs. A businessman 3 rows behind Naomi leaned forward, pulling his earbuds free. A woman with a young child clutched her daughter closer, sensing the unease without understanding it. Even in the insulated bubble of first class, the shift was unmistakable. Naomi Sinclair sat perfectly still, her phone resting on the armrest as if nothing unusual had happened. Her face betrayed nothing, but her pulse drummed with quiet certainty. She knew exactly what would follow. The intercom crackled, and Captain Marcus Hale's voice filled the cabin. It carried strain beneath the practiced calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We have received new instructions from Air Traffic Control. Our clearance has been rescinded, and we've been ordered to return to the gate. At this time, we do not have further information, but we will keep you updated." The murmurs grew louder, rippling through the aircraft. Some passengers groaned in frustration, others exchanged anxious looks. In first class, Elaine Whitford shot up in her seat, her face red with outrage. "This is preposterous," she snapped, looking around for an ally. "We were ready to take off. Charles, call someone. This airline is a disgrace." Charles opened his phone but hesitated. His fingers hovered above the screen before he slowly lowered it back into his lap. Something in his expression had shifted. He was no longer dismissive, no longer smug. He was afraid. Naomi did not look at them. Her eyes remained on the window, watching the pushback tug reattach to the nose gear. The aircraft lurched backward, slowly retracing its path toward the gate. Each motion carried the weight of inevitability. Bridget Owens, the flight attendant, appeared pale as she moved down the aisle. She tried to calm the passengers with reassuring words, but her voice trembled. Naomi caught the way Bridget's gaze flicked to her seat, a silent question, a flicker of recognition. The cockpit door opened. Captain Hale stepped into the cabin, his face drawn tight. The calm authority he had exuded minutes earlier now replaced with unease. His eyes scanned the rows until they landed on Naomi. He walked toward her, each step slow, deliberate. He stopped beside her seat and spoke softly, so only she and a few close passengers could hear. "Dr. Sinclair, that was you, wasn't it?" Naomi met his gaze, her expression calm but firm. "I told you there was a potential safety hazard, Captain. You chose to ignore it, so I escalated it to a level where you could not." Her words were not sharp, but they carried the full weight of consequence. Hale's lips parted as if to respond, but no words came. The color had drained from his face. He looked less like a commander of an aircraft and more like a man who had just realized the ground beneath him was no longer solid. Around them, passengers leaned closer, pretending not to listen but unable to look away. Elaine's fury burned hotter with each second of silence. She hissed across the aisle. "Who do you think you are, disrupting our flight? Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Before Naomi could respond, Hale turned, his voice flat with defeat. "She's the FAA, Mrs. Whitford." The words cut through the cabin like a blade. Elaine's mouth fell open, her fury momentarily silenced. Charles's face turned a sickly shade of gray as the truth settled over him. Naomi remained still, her hands folded neatly on her lap. "When we arrive at the gate," she said calmly, "you will open the main cabin door and wait for the inspection team. This flight is grounded until further notice." The rest of the journey back to the gate was cloaked in tense silence. Economy passengers shifted impatiently in their seats, unaware of the storm unfolding in first class. The first-class cabin itself felt like a courtroom. Naomi seated in quiet authority while others waited for judgment. The jet bridge reconnected with a heavy metallic clank. A moment later, the cabin door opened, not from within, but from the outside. Two uniformed Port Authority officers stepped aboard, followed by a man in a navy blue polo shirt with the FAA insignia stitched over the chest. His presence radiated authority born not of rank, but of unshakable expertise. "Dr. Sinclair," he said, spotting her immediately. His voice carried respect and recognition. "We received your call." "What's the situation?" Naomi stood, her movements composed. "Mark Donovan," she said, greeting him with a nod. "Been above row 1. Forced closed against dimensions. I heard a sound consistent with fracture in the composite latch housing. Crew refused to inspect." Mark's jaw tightened. He looked toward the bin, then at Captain Hale, then at Ryan Keller, who had emerged behind him, his face pale. He did not bother hiding his disapproval. "Right. This aircraft is now under FAA control. No one leaves until my team clears it." He gestured to one of the officers. "Begin deplaning passengers, but collect names and contact information for everyone in first class. They are all witnesses." Whispers rose as first-class passengers realized the gravity of the situation. The Whitfords stiffened as the officer approached, but they complied, scribbling their details onto the manifest sheet with trembling hands. Elaine leaned close to Naomi as she passed. Her voice was a venomous whisper. "You will regret this. My husband is Charles Whitford. You have no idea the mistake you've made." Naomi looked at her, her expression serene. "The mistake, Mrs. Whitford, was when you valued your luggage over the safety of 300 people. The rest is just consequence." Elaine's face flushed crimson. Charles tugged at her arm, pulling her down the aisle as if eager to escape. The cabin emptied row by row, leaving behind only silence and the FAA team. They worked quickly, opening the overhead bin with practiced care. The door sagged visibly on its hinge, no longer flush against the frame. A high-intensity flashlight revealed what Naomi had already known, a hairline crack spiderwebbing from the latch housing deep into the composite panel. "Bingo," Mark muttered grimly. He snapped photos, his face etched with anger. He turned to Captain Hale and First Officer Keller. "You had a certified FAA inspector warning you about a potential failure, and you ignored her. Do you realize what you almost put in the sky?" Hale's shoulders sagged. Keller stared at the floor. Neither answered. Bridget stood nearby, tears glistening in her eyes. She whispered, "I tried. I told them it was too big. But when Mr. Whitford showed me that card, I was scared. They tell us to do whatever it takes for Apex members. They call it the Apex experience. I thought I would lose my job." Naomi listened quietly, her heart heavy. This was not just about arrogance or fear. It was about a system that had trained employees to bow to privilege at the expense of safety. The crack in the bin was not an accident. It was inevitable, the product of a culture that rewarded appeasement over integrity. Mark placed a hand on Bridget's shoulder. "Your statement will be important. Do not blame yourself for the choices they forced on you." Naomi exhaled slowly, the adrenaline in her veins beginning to ebb. She felt no triumph, no vindication, only a deep sadness. This disruption had been avoidable. All it had taken was one moment of courage, one choice to trust safety over entitlement. Instead, it had fallen to her to be the consequence. As technicians removed the bin for transport to the lab, Naomi sank back into her seat. Outside the window, the lights of JFK twinkled against the night sky. Somewhere in those lights, the story of this flight was already spreading, traveling faster than any plane could carry it. She closed her eyes, steadying her breath. The confrontation was over, but the fallout was just beginning. The first-class cabin no longer felt like a sanctuary of privilege. It had transformed into a stage where every unspoken rule of power and deference had been rewritten. Naomi Sinclair sat quietly, but all eyes followed her. She was no longer just another passenger. She was the fulcrum on which the fate of the flight had shifted. Mark Donovan moved with quiet authority, directing his team as they photographed, measured, and dismantled the overhead bin. The sound of tools echoed strangely against the hushed cabin. What had once been the background music of luxury travel had become the soundtrack of accountability. Passengers from economy and business class were already being escorted off the plane. Their frustration spilled into muttered complaints as they shuffled down the jet bridge, clutching their carry-ons. But in first class, those who remained lingered in silence, watching the spectacle unfold with a mix of awe and unease. Naomi kept her gaze steady, watching the FAA team at work. Each step of their inspection confirmed what she had known the instant she heard the fracture. The bin door sagged, the latch showed stress marks, and the composite housing bore a spiderweb crack that could have expanded mid-flight. She imagined the chaos it would have unleashed. Luggage crashing down on passengers, the potential injuries, the panic in the confined space 30,000 feet in the air. Elaine Whitford, who had once been so loud, now sat stiff and silent, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her earlier bravado had drained away, leaving only the brittle shell of defiance. Charles Whitford sat beside her, his phone clutched tightly in his hand but unused, his eyes fixed on the floor as though the carpet held the answers he had failed to provide. Mark finished photographing the fracture and turned toward the crew. His expression was stern, his tone sharper than before. "Captain Hale, First Officer Keller, Flight Attendant Owens, you will each provide separate statements, right now." The three exchanged uneasy glances. Hale nodded heavily, the weight of decades of service now collapsing onto his shoulders. "I made a judgment call," he admitted quietly. "I thought it was nothing. I didn't see damage. I didn't want to delay the flight." Mark's voice hardened. "You didn't look for damage. You dismissed a federal inspector in your cabin and took the word of a passenger over hers. That is not a judgment call. That is negligence." Ryan Keller shifted uncomfortably. His earlier arrogance had completely dissolved. When Mark turned his gaze on him, Keller swallowed hard. I thought she was just overreacting. I didn't realize what Mark pressed, that she was FAA. Ryan stammered. Mark let the silence hang. Or didn't realize that a black woman in first class could also be the most qualified voice in the room. The question cut deeper than Keller wanted to admit. His lips parted, but no answer came. His silence was answer enough. Bridget Owens stood trembling, her eyes brimming with tears. Mark's tone softened only slightly when he turned to her. "Ms. Owens, you tried to stop this bag, didn't you?" She nodded, her voice breaking. "Yes. I told them it was too large. I tried to follow procedure, but Mr. Whitford, he showed me his Apex card. He said he would call my supervisor. They tell us every day to put those passengers first. They make us believe our jobs depend on it." Mark glanced at Naomi, and she could see the shared recognition in his eyes. This was bigger than one bin, one flight, one arrogant passenger. It was a symptom of something systemic, a culture that rewarded deference to power even when safety was at stake. "Your statement will matter," Mark told Bridget. "You will have the chance to tell the truth." As the technicians carried the broken bin assembly down the aisle, Naomi finally stood. She walked closer to Mark, her voice low but firm. "This is not just about one incident. If this aircraft had a compromised bin, others might too. If the crew is this intimidated by Apex members, that culture is everywhere. This is not an isolated failure. It is structural." Mark nodded. "I know, and now it will be investigated at that level." For a moment, Naomi allowed herself a breath of relief. The system was moving. The weight she had carried since the moment she heard that crack was beginning to shift from her shoulders to the machinery of accountability. But the passengers had their own interpretations. A man across the aisle leaned forward, his voice hushed. "So, you're the reason we're not in the air right now." Naomi turned toward him, her expression steady. "I am the reason you are not 30,000 feet above the Atlantic when that bin gave way." His eyes widened, and he sank back into his seat without another word. Elaine finally found her voice, brittle and trembling. "This is outrageous. We've been humiliated for nothing. That bag was fine. This woman is power tripping. You'll see. My husband has influence. This won't stand." Naomi met her glare with quiet calm. "What won't stand, Mrs. Whitford, is a culture that lets arrogance endanger lives. That culture broke tonight, and it started with your bag." Elaine's cheeks burned. She looked away, but the silence of others in the cabin spoke volumes. The audience she had once commanded was no longer hers. Captain Hale returned from giving his preliminary statement, his face hollow. He paused at Naomi's seat, his voice heavy with remorse. "Dr. Sinclair, I was wrong. I should have listened. His words faltered. "I don't know what else to say." Naomi regarded him for a long moment. He was a man who had spent decades holding authority, now stripped of it in a single night. She did not gloat, did not condemn him further. "The best thing you can say," she replied softly, "is that it will not happen again." His eyes dropped. "Yes, ma'am." The inspection team worked late into the night, documenting every detail. The passengers were eventually escorted off, some grumbling about delays, others subdued by the realization of how close they had come to disaster. The Whitfords left last, Elaine's fury vibrating off her like static, Charles moving quickly to avoid cameras waiting beyond the jet bridge. Naomi was the last passenger to leave. As she stepped into the cool air of the terminal, she glanced back at the aircraft. Its massive frame gleamed under the floodlights, but she saw it differently now, not as a marvel of engineering or a vessel of human ambition, but as a reminder of fragility. One crack, one dismissal, one act of arrogance had nearly unraveled it all. She walked beside Mark, her voice quiet. It always amazes me how the smallest fracture can reveal the deepest fault lines. Mark nodded grimly, and it always takes someone willing to stand in the silence and name it. Tonight, that was you. Naomi said nothing more. She did not need to. The authority had shifted, not through loud voices or privilege, but through truth spoken with calm precision. And that truth would ripple far beyond the walls of the aircraft. The airport terminal had long since quieted. Midnight hours turned the glass walls of JFK into black mirrors reflecting weary travelers, security officers, and crews moving like shadows in fluorescent light. But in Gate C-41 the world still felt charged. The grounded aircraft loomed outside, floodlights bathing its fuselage in a pale, unforgiving glow. Inside, the cabin of that plane no longer belonged to passengers or airline crew. It belonged to the FAA. Naomi Sinclair stood near the entrance of the jet bridge, arms folded, her leather briefcase at her feet. Mark Donovan's team had been working for hours. Their toolkits spread across the first-class aisle, their movements careful and methodical. Every few minutes the silence was broken by the click of a camera or the low murmur of engineers cross-checking measurements. Naomi had thought she might feel vindicated when the evidence came to light. Instead, she felt heavy, as if the entire weight of the system's failures pressed on her chest. She had wanted to be wrong. She had wanted the sound she heard to be nothing but paranoia, a phantom echo. But she knew better. Her instincts had never lied. One of the technicians, a stocky man with safety glasses perched on his forehead, looked up from the disassembled bin. "We've got something," he said. His voice carried across the cabin like a verdict. Mark approached first. Naomi followed. The overhead compartment above row 1 lay in pieces, its internal structure exposed under the glare of portable lamps. The fracture was no longer just a hairline crack. It ran deeper, branching like lightning across the composite panel, reaching into the very spine of the housing that supported the bin's load-bearing points. "God," Mark muttered, his jaw tightening. He ran a gloved hand close to the crack without touching it. "This isn't surface damage. This is structural compromise." The technician handed over a high-resolution scan. The image showed delamination in the material, layers of resin and fiber separating where they should have been fused solid. Naomi felt her stomach tighten. She had studied enough wreckage to know what those lines meant. "At 2.5 Gs, the technician explained, "which you'd hit in moderate turbulence, this bin would have failed. Whole assembly could have detached. And, considering the load," he gestured to the manifest printout taped nearby, "we're talking 140 pounds minimum. All of it would have come down right here." Naomi followed his finger to the exact row. Her own seat, row 2, directly beneath the failing bin. She felt the echo of her father's words. Long ago, "Nothing heavy is too heavy if you understand the science." But tonight the science carried a different weight, one that pressed against her with chilling clarity. Mark exhaled, his breath sharp. We need to pull the adjacent bins, too. If one is compromised, others might be. The team moved quickly, removing panels, checking latches, shining flashlights into every joint. Within half an hour, more problems surfaced. Stress fractures in 2 additional bins, micro cracks around hinge mounts that had been logged as sticky doors and maintenance records but never properly investigated. The evidence piled up until it could no longer be denied. This wasn't a single act of passenger arrogance. It wasn't even a single crew failure. It was systemic. Mark straightened, rubbing a hand over his shaved head. They've been ignoring these signs for months, lubricating hinges instead of checking structural components. This isn't negligence. This is policy. They've been cutting corners. Naomi felt a chill despite the warm cabin air. She had suspected as much, but hearing it said aloud gave it shape. An airline's entire maintenance culture built on shortcuts, leaving cracks hidden until someone forced them open. Her mind raced with implications. If this was true for one aircraft, what about the rest of the fleet? How many other bins were ready to fail? How many other logs dismissed the way hers had been tonight? She glanced at Bridget Owens, who stood quietly against the bulkhead, arms wrapped tightly around herself. The young flight attendant had been dismissed earlier, intimidated into silence by threats of Apex members and corporate pressure. Now she looked as though her entire world was unraveling. Naomi walked to her, speaking gently. "You tried to stop this. Don't forget that." Bridget shook her head. "I gave in. I let them push me. I let that bag stay." "You're human," Naomi replied softly. "And you're part of a system that made you afraid to follow the rules. That is not on you. That is on them." Tears welled in Bridget's eyes, but for the first time that night, Naomi saw something shift in her expression. The beginnings of resolve, the quiet realization that she could speak, that her voice might carry weight now. The hours ticked past, each new finding deepening the case. By 3 a.m, the decision was official. The aircraft was grounded indefinitely. The broken bin assembly was crated, sealed, and labeled for transport to LaGuardia's materials lab. All maintenance records for the plane were seized. Every statement from the crew was logged. When Mark finally returned to Naomi, exhaustion lined his face, but so did grim determination. "We're widening this fleet-wide inspection, effective immediately. They can't fly another 777 until every bin assembly is cleared. If this is happening here, it's happening everywhere." Naomi nodded slowly. She knew what that meant. Canceled flights, chaos across international routes, stock prices plummeting, an airline brought to its knees because of arrogance and shortcuts, and, at the center of it all, a single hateful whisper that had told her she didn't belong. She thought again of Elaine Whitford, her venomous tone as she had said, "This isn't Coach, dear." Elaine had thought she was protecting her space, preserving her privilege. Instead, she had exposed a fracture that stretched far beyond the bin above her head. Naomi closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply. She had no desire for vengeance, no satisfaction in the ruin she knew was coming. All she wanted was safety, accountability, a system that valued integrity over convenience. But sometimes the only way to build that system was to tear down the one that existed. When she opened her eyes again, the cabin was empty, stripped of passengers, stripped of pretense. What remained were the bones of truth, and she was not afraid of them. Outside, dawn began to touch the horizon with the faintest glow of gray. A new day was coming, and with it, consequences. Naomi picked up her briefcase, the leather handle warm in her grip. She turned to Mark. "Make sure the record shows everything. No omissions, no softening." Mark gave a tired but resolute nod. "It will. This won't be buried." Naomi walked down the aisle one last time, past the dismantled panels and scattered tools, past the empty seat where Elaine had sat with her shawl pulled tight and her mouth curled in disdain. She paused briefly at row 1, looking at the silver case still resting on the ground, tagged and waiting for inspection. Then she stepped onto the jet bridge, her heels striking softly against the carpet, her presence calm but unyielding. She knew the investigation had only begun. The fallout would ripple through boardrooms, through congressional hearings, through the very culture of aviation. But tonight it had started here, with a whisper, a crack, and the choice to stand firm. And Naomi Sinclair had been the catalyst. By the time the sun broke over the Atlantic coast, the story had already begun to spread. It traveled first in whispers across terminal lounges, then in half-truths through text messages, and finally in bold headlines on aviation blogs. A transatlantic flight grounded minutes before departure, an FAA inspector on board, an investigation into possible structural failure. What had unfolded in the sealed cabin of Flight 227 was no longer private. It was becoming public, and public stories grew with every retelling. Naomi Sinclair knew this well. As she walked through the terminal that morning, a quiet observer among the shuffle of delayed passengers, she caught the words repeated again and again. Some woman grounded the flight, FAA inspector, first-class drama. It had already taken shape, the tale of an unlikely interruption, dramatic enough to make strangers lean in closer when they heard it. At the FAA's temporary command post near Gate C-41, Mark Donovan's team continued their work. Naomi watched from a chair in the corner, her laptop open, her preliminary report taking form in meticulous paragraphs. She wrote with precision, stripping away emotion, leaving only the facts. Yet every sentence carried weight. Every sentence was evidence that arrogance had collided with authority and lost. Around noon, Mark sat beside her, holding a folder thick with maintenance records. His face was grim. "We pulled their logs for the last 6 months," he said. "That bin wasn't the first. It was reported 3 times as sticky. Each time they marked it as lubricated hinges. Never once did they check structure." Naomi felt her jaw tighten. They buried it under routine. Mark nodded. "And it's not just this plane. We've already found similar notes on at least 7 others. This is systematic negligence." Her chest grew heavy. She had feared as much, but hearing it confirmed gave it sharper edges. She thought about the passengers who had been moments from takeoff. She thought about Bridget Owens, pressured to bend rules to satisfy wealthy clients. She thought about Captain Hale, too weary to challenge privilege, and Ryan Keller, too arrogant to see past his own bias. And she thought about Elaine Whitford. One voice, dripping with disdain, had pulled the thread, and now the entire tapestry was unraveling. By evening, news anchors were speculating live. The FAA had not yet released a formal statement, but leaks were already shaping the narrative. Grounding by an FAA inspector on board, concerns about airline safety culture. First-class altercation raises questions of bias and procedure. The words crawled across television screens in airports, hotels, and living rooms. Naomi kept her phone silenced, her inbox swelling with requests she had no intention of answering. She was not the story, or at least she did not want to be. Her work was to ensure safety, not to become a headline, but the headlines came anyway. By the second day, her name had leaked. Reporters stood outside the FAA's regional office in Queens, waiting with cameras. Some shouted questions as she arrived, asking if she had truly grounded the flight with a single call. She answered none of them, walking past with steady steps, her silence more powerful than any comment. Behind closed doors, the investigation widened. Every 777 in the airline's fleet was ordered inspected within 72 hours. The chaos this unleashed was immediate. Flights were canceled across the globe. Passengers stranded in foreign airports, connections missed. The airline scrambled to issue vouchers and apologies, but the anger spread faster than their customer service lines could contain. On the third night, Naomi sat alone in her apartment overlooking the East River. She'd avoided the news as best she could, but a notification slipped through, and curiosity led her to open it. The headline struck her with a mixture of inevitability and sadness. Passenger who challenged FAA inspector identified as socialite Elaine Whitford. The article displayed pictures of Elaine and Charles at charity galas, magazine spreads of their Connecticut estate, captions about their influence in logistics and trade. Naomi scrolled slowly, her face impassive, though she could almost hear Elaine's whisper again. "This isn't Coach, dear." The irony was brutal, and trying to diminish someone she assumed had no place beside her. Elaine had instead brought the harshest spotlight upon herself, and the world was not kind to arrogance when it was exposed. By morning, social media was ablaze. Hashtags trended. Clips of passengers describing the incident surfaced. She told the inspector she didn't belong. The crew ignored her warnings. The FAA had to step in. The phrase "flying while black" resurfaced. A familiar wound stitched into a new story. Naomi closed her laptop. She did not want to see herself reduced to a symbol. Her work transformed into a meme. But she also knew the power of public outrage. It could burn indiscriminately. But sometimes it burned through the rot that institutions refused to confront. At the airline's headquarters, executives scrambled. Their conference rooms buzzed with panic. Their legal teams braced for hearings. Their investors demanded answers. The CEO's carefully rehearsed statement promised cooperation, promised reforms, promised that safety was their highest priority. Naomi knew those words. She had heard them before, but she also knew words meant little without change. Meanwhile, the Whitford's empire began to crack. Charles's shipping company, Whitford Global Logistics, was suddenly under scrutiny. Reporters dug through public records, uncovering whispers of questionable cargo declarations, weight discrepancies, and sweetheart deals with the very airline now in crisis. The more they looked, the more questions surfaced. Elaine, once photographed in shimmering gowns, now found her image shared online as the face of entitlement. Comment threads seethed with anger. She had become a symbol of prejudice and arrogance, and symbols rarely survived in the court of public opinion. Naomi, sitting once again across from Mark in a conference room, felt the sweep of it all pressing in. Mark leaned back in his chair, exhaustion in his eyes. "You realize this is bigger than aviation?" "Right. This is about culture, about how power bends rules until they break. Naomi nodded. She thought of Bridget, who had cried in the aisle yet found courage and truth. She thought of Hale, broken under the weight of his failure. She thought of herself, sitting silently, hearing a crack that no one else had heard. It always starts small, she said quietly. A whisper, a crack, a dismissal. But when you ignore the small things, they don't stay small. They grow until they break everything. Mark studied her for a long moment, and sometimes it takes one person who refuses to let it slide. She looked out the window. Planes rose into the winter sky, their contrails slicing across pale blue. To most, they were just dots in the distance. To her, they were promises, fragile yet vital. She thought about the millions who trusted that promise each day, unaware of the fractures hidden beneath. The dominoes were still falling. She did not know where they would land, but she knew one truth with certainty. She had not called for vengeance. She had called for safety, and in that call, the entire system had shifted. As night settled again, Naomi closed her report. It was nearly complete. Soon it would move to Washington, to boardrooms, to hearings. She would testify. She would answer questions. She would sit under bright lights while others judged her decisions. She was ready. But for now, she sat in quiet stillness, the echo of that whisper still in her memory, a reminder of how much could change in the span of 5 minutes. The Whitfords had always lived above the storm. Their names graced charity boards, their faces appeared in glossy magazines, and their mansion on the Connecticut coast hosted governors and CEOs alike. For years, Elaine and Charles Whitford floated through life on a cushion of wealth, power, and the certainty that consequences were for other people. That illusion shattered within days of Flight 227's grounding. By the end of the week, Elaine's name was unavoidable. The video clips taken discreetly by other first-class passengers, her words, her dismissive tone, her venomous whisper were shared millions of times. She had told a black woman in a green silk blouse that she did not belong in first class. The internet remembered every detail. Commentators dissected her expression frame by frame. The tilt of her chin, the curl of her lips, the icy certainty with which she tried to dismiss Dr. Naomi Sinclair as though she were invisible. Headlines were merciless. When privilege backfires, this isn't coach, this is consequence, the woman who grounded herself. Elaine shut her curtains, refusing to leave her mansion. But the world would not forget her. Every time she scrolled through her phone, she saw her own face weaponized into memes, her own words turned against her. She had become a national symbol of arrogance and prejudice, and symbols were not easily redeemed. Charles had his own reckoning. At Whitford Global Logistics headquarters, phones rang nonstop. Government investigators requested cargo records. The FAA demanded shipping manifests. The Department of Transportation asked for weight logs. The company's legal team whispered the word no CEO wanted to hear subpoena. The tip that had reached the FAA days earlier now revealed its truth. Whitford Global had been underreporting cargo weights for years, shaving off percentages to cut costs, to cheat contracts, to maximize profits. It was not an isolated mistake. It was systemic fraud. And now, with the airline scandal spreading, investigators had no reason to look away. Charles sat in his office late at night, staring at spreadsheets that had once been sources of pride. He had built his empire on efficiency, on shaving every edge, on ensuring his competitors could never quite match his margins. Now, those same spreadsheets looked like evidence. The board of directors was no longer loyal. They whispered behind closed doors, consulted lawyers, and weighed their own futures. Charles could feel their distance growing. He had always been the center of the room. Now he was its liability. Elaine and Charles tried to retreat together, but even in the privacy of their home, the tension boiled. Elaine snapped at reporters camped at their gates. Charles shouted into phones, trying to salvage contracts that evaporated as quickly as he dialed. They blamed each other in quiet, bitter arguments. "You humiliated us," Charles accused one night, pacing their marble kitchen. "If you had just kept quiet, none of this would have spiraled like it has." Elaine's eyes flared. "Don't you dare put this on me. You built an empire of lies. If anyone ruined us, it was you." Their words echoed through their empty halls, bouncing off walls lined with art bought at charity auctions, now destined for auction houses to cover legal fees. The collapse of privilege was not quiet. It was noisy, bitter, and merciless. Meanwhile, the airline itself was in freefall. The FAA's inspection order forced Transatlantic Airways to ground nearly a quarter of its international fleet. Passengers flooded airports demanding answers, stranded in Paris, Tokyo, São Paulo. News anchors used words like crisis and catastrophic failure of oversight. Investors pulled out. The stock plummeted. The CEO, a man named Lawrence Tate, appeared before Congress 2 weeks later, trying to hold himself steady under the glare of televised hearings. Naomi Sinclair watched from her office as he shifted uncomfortably, sweating under questions about safety records, Apex member privileges, and ignored maintenance warnings. His answers were polished but hollow. She recognized the language of corporate survival, empty promises to do better, carefully constructed apologies designed to deflect. But this time, deflection would not save him. Evidence spoke louder than his words. The reports Naomi and Mark had filed laid everything bare. Inspections ignored. Safety reports downgraded. Pressure on staff to accommodate wealth over regulations. One senator leaned across the table, his voice sharp. "So your airline prioritized the comfort of elite passengers over the safety of 300 souls in the air. Do you understand what that means?" The CEO stammered. Cameras caught it. Headlines amplified it. Stockholders saw it. His career ended in that moment. Naomi, watching, felt no triumph, only a quiet sadness. The airline could have chosen safety at any point. They could have listened when small warnings surfaced. Instead, they ignored, delayed, and minimized until the fracture grew too large to hide. She thought again of Bridget Owens, her trembling confession that she was told to do anything to keep Apex members satisfied. Naomi knew Bridget's words would echo in hearings, in labor negotiations, in reforms yet to be written. Out of her fear had come truth, and from truth might come change. As for Elaine, her fall grew harsher each day. Invitations to charity events vanished. Clubs rescinded memberships. Friends stopped answering her calls. The world that had once embraced her now recoiled. Reporters caught her one morning leaving her mansion, sunglasses shielding her eyes. The questions cut sharp. "Mrs. Whitford, do you regret your words? Do you believe first class should be segregated by privilege? What do you say to those who call you the face of modern entitlement?" Elaine pushed past them, but every step deepened her isolation. Her name, once a ticket into any room, had become a warning label. Charles faced worse. Federal indictments loomed. His attorneys spoke of plea deals. His empire, Whitford Global Logistics, filed for bankruptcy within a month. Government contracts were canceled. Competitors devoured what remained. Naomi read the headlines with the same calm she had carried on the plane. She did not celebrate their downfall, but she recognized it for what it was, the inevitable collapse of a system built on arrogance. Her own role had shifted too. Within the FAA, colleagues spoke of the Sinclair call. The Night 1 inspector's insistence prevented catastrophe. Some spoke with admiration, others with caution, but all recognized it had altered the balance of authority between regulators and airlines. At night, in her apartment, Naomi sat by her window and thought of her father, of how he had taught her to listen to the small sounds, the hidden warnings, the things others overlooked. He had told her integrity was a weight worth carrying, even when others mocked it, especially when others mocked it. She carried that weight still, and as she watched the collapse of privilege unfold across headlines and hearings, she understood something profound. Consequences are not punishment. They are gravity, and gravity always wins. The hearings stretched on for weeks. Lawmakers questioned executives, flight crews, and regulators under bright lights while cameras broadcast every word to a restless nation. What had begun as a single flight's grounding had become a full-blown reckoning for the airline industry, and at the center of it stood the quiet, unshakable testimony of Dr. Naomi Sinclair. When she spoke, the room fell into a hush. She did not perform for the cameras or adjust her tone to curry favor. She spoke plainly, with precision born of years in the field. She described the crack she had heard, the physics of composite stress failure, the regulations ignored by those in command. She detailed how corporate culture had pressured crew members into silence, how maintenance logs had been manipulated to disguise systemic negligence. Air safety does not bend to privilege, Naomi said during her testimony. It cannot be negotiated with loyalty cards or silenced by intimidation. If you compromise the smallest rule, you compromise the entire structure. The passengers aboard Flight 227 never knew how close they came to being in the path of collapse. But I knew. I acted because silence was not an option. Her words traveled far beyond the chamber. They replayed on evening news programs, shared across social platforms, quoted in editorials. For many, Naomi became a symbol not just of regulatory authority, but of quiet defiance against the way prejudice and privilege distorted justice. Yet Naomi herself resisted the idea of being a symbol. She knew the work ahead was less glamorous and far more difficult. Policy had to change. Training had to evolve. Protections for flight attendants and crew had to be written into law. She accepted the role not of celebrity, but of builder. One afternoon, weeks after the hearings, Bridget Owens came to see her. The young flight attendant walked into Naomi's office at the FAA headquarters in Washington, her uniform replaced by a simple navy dress. She looked stronger now, though her eyes still carried the memory of that night. "Dr. Sinclair," Bridget began, her voice steady but emotional. "I wanted to thank you. I thought that night ruined me. I thought I had failed. But because you stood your ground, I realized I wasn't powerless. I spoke at my union meeting last week. I told them what really happened, and they listened." Naomi gestured for her to sit. "You didn't fail. Bridget, you were forced into an impossible choice. The failure was never yours. It was in the system that made you fear doing your job." Bridget nodded slowly. They're calling it the Sinclair Protocol now, a rule in our training manuals. If a crew member raises a safety concern, no matter who challenges it, it must be respected and escalated. No Apex card, no elite status can override it. She paused, tears gathering but not falling. You gave us that. You gave us back our voice. Naomi felt something shift inside her, a quiet warmth in contrast to the cold weight of investigations and reports. This was why she endured the scrutiny, why she faced down arrogance in the aisle of that aircraft. Not for headlines, not for punishment, but for change that outlasted her. At the same time, industry reforms began to take shape. The FAA implemented randomized inspections of cargo weights, ensuring that companies like Whitford Global could never again falsify numbers without risk of discovery. Training programs for pilots and crew incorporated anti-bias modules alongside technical instruction, acknowledging that prejudice could cloud judgment as dangerously as fatigue. The airline, under court-monitored restructuring, issued a public apology and pledged billions to overhaul its safety culture. Executives were replaced, maintenance crews were retrained. For the first time in decades, regulators, unions, and airlines sat at the same table not to bargain, but to rebuild trust. Still, Naomi remained cautious. Culture did not shift overnight. She knew too well that institutions often promise change only to slip back into old habits once scrutiny faded. She pushed for oversight committees, long-term audits, and transparent reporting. She became a relentless advocate for what she called the human factor, the idea that safety was not just about metal and math, but about empowering people to speak and be heard. Late one evening, Naomi stayed in her office long after her colleagues had gone home. The city lights glimmered through her window, a constellation of their own. On her desk sat a letter, handwritten and creased from being folded too many times. It was from a mother who had flown on Flight 227 with her teenage son. I did not know what was happening that night. The letter read, I only knew we were delayed and people were angry. I did not know you were saving my child's life. I wanted you to know that I see you now. We see you. Thank you. Naomi held the letter gently, her eyes closing for a moment. She thought of all the lives that had passed through the narrow space of that cabin. Hundreds of stories, hundreds of families, all carried by forces they could not see. Safety was invisible until it failed. Her work ensured it remained invisible. Meanwhile, the Whitfords continued their descent. Charles faced formal indictment. His company dismantled piece by piece in federal court. Elaine retreated further into obscurity, her name still synonymous with entitlement. The empire they had built was gone, undone by their own arrogance. Naomi did not rejoice in their ruin, but she recognized it as necessary. Gravity had done its work. As months turned into a year, Naomi's influence grew within the FAA. She was promoted to Deputy Director of the Office of Aviation Safety, her new role giving her authority not only to enforce, but to reshape policy. Colleagues admired her, even those who once dismissed her. She had earned her position not through spectacle, but through unwavering integrity. One afternoon, during a conference on aviation reform, a journalist asked her if she believed the fallout from Flight 227 had been too harsh. Naomi considered the question carefully before answering. Consequences are not harsh, she said evenly. They are proportionate. Every action carries weight, and when that weight is ignored, it accumulates until something breaks. Flight 227 was not about one bag, one whisper, or one inspector. It was about years of small compromises adding up to something dangerous. The consequences we see now are not punishment. They are balance restored. Her words echoed through the auditorium. A reminder to every airline executive and regulator that integrity could not be optional. In quiet moments, Naomi still thought of that night, the heavy silence of the first-class cabin, the venom in Elaine's voice, the dismissive glance from Ryan Keller, the fatigue in Captain Hale's eyes. She thought of the sound only she had heard, that sharp crack like a warning from the bones of the aircraft itself. She knew she would carry those memories for the rest of her life, not as scars, but as markers. Proof that one person, steady in conviction, could stop the unraveling of a system. Reform was never glamorous. It was slow, grinding, often thankless, but renewal was possible. And as Naomi watched new safety protocols take hold, as she saw young inspectors trained with stronger voices, she felt something close to hope. The skies would never be perfect, but they would be safer, and that was enough. A year had passed since Flight 227 never left the ground. The world had moved on in its restless way, chasing new headlines and fresh scandals. But for those who had lived it, the echoes remained. For Dr. Naomi Sinclair, those echoes were not just memories. They were reminders of why she rose each morning, why she carried herself with quiet purpose, why she still believed in the fragile promise of flight. From her office window in Washington, she often paused to watch the sky. Airplanes traced their arcs high above, leaving white scars of condensation across blue. To most people, they were distant specks, but to Naomi, they were stories. Inside every fuselage were lives suspended between destinations, trusting that the hidden mechanics beneath them were sound, that the human decisions guiding them were wise. It was trust she had spent her career protecting. Yet, in the silence of her office, Naomi sometimes replayed that night. She remembered Elaine Whitford's whisper, that icy dismissal delivered like a knife. She remembered the heat of anger that rose in her chest, an anger she forced into stillness. She remembered the sharp crack of composite fracture, a sound no one else had heard, and how it had carried the weight of hundreds of lives in its pitch. What if she had ignored it? What if she had chosen silence, chosen the easier path of blending into the background? The thought haunted her. It reminded her that integrity was not only about knowledge, it was about courage at the precise moment when courage was required. The consequences of that courage were still unfolding. The airline, though battered, had survived its reckoning. Its new leadership embraced reforms with unusual sincerity, perhaps because they had no choice. Pilots received new training on bias and authority. Flight attendants now had protections that gave them the power to stop unsafe practices without fear of reprisal. Inspections were more rigorous, records more transparent. The FAA, too, had evolved. Naomi's voice carried weight in every meeting she attended. She had become a compass for younger inspectors, a reminder that precision and compassion were not opposites, but companions. They called her the Sentinel in quiet admiration, a nickname she never acknowledged but secretly cherished. Her personal life had shifted as well. The isolation she had felt on that flight, the loneliness of being dismissed and doubted, had softened under the gratitude of strangers who now saw her differently. Letters still arrived at her office, some typed, some handwritten, many stained with tears. Parents thanking her, flight attendants calling her a hero, passengers who said they had found courage in their own lives because of her story. Naomi accepted their words with humility. She never saw herself as a hero. She saw herself as someone who had done her job. But perhaps that was the lesson people needed most, that doing your job, doing it fully, doing it with honesty, even when it is inconvenient or frightening, was itself a radical act. Elaine and Charles Whitford had vanished from the headlines, but Naomi knew their story lingered in the public imagination. The image of Elaine's smirk, the arrogance of Charles flashing his loyalty card, had become cultural shorthand for entitlement undone. Their empire was gone, their reputations dust. Naomi did not revel in their ruin. She rarely thought of them now, except as proof of what unchecked arrogance eventually brings. One evening, Naomi attended a small ceremony at the FAA's training center. The graduates of a new inspector class were receiving their certifications. She was invited to speak, though she kept her remarks short. She told them about her father, who had taught her to listen to the quiet signs of strain in the world around her. She told them that every detail mattered, no matter how small. As she stepped away from the podium, a young woman approached her. She wore the fresh uniform of an inspector, the eagerness of youth in her eyes. "Dr. Sinclair," she said, her voice trembling with nerves, "I just want you to know, I'm here because of you. I read everything about what happened. I want to be the kind of inspector who doesn't back down." Naomi placed a hand gently on the young woman's shoulder. "Then remember this," she said softly. "Your authority is not about power. It is about responsibility. You may stand alone one day, and it will feel unbearable, but trust the truth you carry. It is stronger than you think." Later that night, Naomi walked outside, the cool air brushing against her face. The roar of a departing aircraft echoed above, a low thunder fading into distance. She tilted her head back and watched its lights climb, piercing the darkness. For the first time in a long time, she felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel. She felt peace. The world was imperfect, always on the edge of failure, always balancing between greed and safety, arrogance and humility. But she had seen how a fracture could expose rot, how a single call could force a system to face itself. She had seen how change, slow and uneven as it was, could still be real. As she stood under the night sky, Naomi reflected on the simple truth she had carried from that night on Flight 227. Dignity is not silence, and justice is not loud. True power is steady, quiet, and relentless. It does not need to shout. It simply acts, and the world shifts. She thought of Bridget Owens, now a strong advocate for crew rights. She thought of Mark Donovan, still a steadfast colleague. She thought of the passengers whose lives had unknowingly hinged on her decision. And she thought of the countless inspectors, attendants, and pilots yet to come, each of them carrying forward the lesson she had embodied. In her heart, Naomi knew she had not just grounded a flight. She had grounded a culture of disregard, forcing it to rebuild from the foundation. And though she would never seek glory for it, she allowed herself one small acknowledgement as she watched the blinking light of the aircraft fade into the stars. It was worth it. Every stare, every dismissal, every whisper that told her she did not belong. She belonged, she always had, and as long as she held her post beneath the wide, restless sky, no whisper would ever erase that truth again. So what do we take away from the day Flight 227 never left the ground? It began with arrogance, with a poisonous whisper meant to remind a woman of her place. But it ended with a lesson that echoed across an entire industry. Integrity cannot be silenced, and dignity cannot be denied. Doctor, Naomi Sinclair did not raise her voice. She did not fight back with anger. She fought back with knowledge, with calm authority, with the strength to act when everyone else looked away. Because of her, hundreds of passengers walked safely back into the terminal. Because of her, an airline was forced to confront the rot inside its own culture. Because of her, change began. And yet, this is not just Naomi's story. It is a reminder to us all. Prejudice and entitlement can shatter lives, but when met with courage, they can also expose the truth. This is about justice. It is about humanity. It is about never underestimating the quiet power of someone who knows their worth. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Let's carry these lessons forward, together, as we prepare for the next story that demands to be told.